we've missed the other person. Okay, so let's start. We've got a limited amount of time. We've got up to 25 minutes for the first question, but before we do that, let's introduce ourselves again. So starting with Richard Griffin. Richard.
Hello again, everyone. So I'm Richard Griffin. I work at King's College London, where I do workforce research, but I've been working since 2014 with the North West London employers in health and social care, including around supported employment.
Okay, Nurjahan.
Hi everyone, Nurjahan from the Voluntary Partnerships team at NHS England, NHS Improvement, specifically on youth volunteering and youth voice, but talking about voluntary partnerships and volunteering.
Steve.
Hi again. I'm from the National Centre for Mental Health in Cardiff University, and as part of that, I'm evaluating and part of a consortium delivering the Engage to Change project, which is a national up to 25 supported employment programme across Wales. And we're in our year, just gone over year 4. So we've got some quite interesting experience there, including running supported internships underneath that.
Mike.
Afternoon, Mike Franklin, Joint Director of Equality and Inclusion, NHS England, NHS Inclusion, and a Non-Executive Director at South London and Maudsley. Chair of the Workforce and the Equalities Committee.
Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm from the NHS Business Services Authority, and I'm currently working as part of the NHS Jobs project to redevelop the service, with giving it a complete revamp, essentially. So, yeah.
Yolande.
Hi everyone, Yolande Burgess at London Councils. I'm a director there and working currently through the Young People's Education and Skills Board that I look after, working with leaders, both political and officers across London, to make sure that we advocate on behalf of people with learning difficulties and disabilities.
Okay, and Stephen, and then John. Oh,
Hi folks, I'm Steve Lismore. I'm the policy lead for disability, specifically on learning disability and autism within Department of Work and Pensions, and previously led on disability confidence, so got quite a long background in all of this area.
John Paul.
Hi, and I'm John Paul. I'm working with Leander on the LDEP reports, as mentioned.
Rebecca. Organiser extraordinaire.
Hi there, I work for the National Development Team for Inclusion and I support a number of different projects, but a lot of the work is with preparing for adulthood.
So we have this question, do we have somebody who is not me, the facilitator, and not the note taker, who would be willing to feed back on the answers to C and D to the main group? That is our first task. Who would be willing to feed back? Question is, has COVID-19 offered, or can it offer, some opportunities for the employment of people with a learning disability within the NHS or further afield? Who might be willing to feed back? Because you'll need to make some notes in order that you can feed back.
I don't mind doing that, but I didn't get to say hello.
Who?
Ruth Perry.
Oh, sorry, Ruth. Hello, say hello, Ruth.
Very quickly, Ruth Perry, I'm Senior Policy Manager at NatSpec, which is the membership body for specialist further education colleges. Part of my remit is to support colleges to enable more young people with learning disabilities to progress.
Okay, so
and
we are
to keep
looking
my mind focused. I will take some notes.
Thank you. We will be taking notes of the session. You'll only need to take notes of that which you feel we should be feeding back, so you can participate fully. Yeah, and you can just say what you want to take away from that which we've discussed. So folks, has COVID-19 offered any opportunities, or could it offer any new opportunities within the NHS or beyond for the employment of people with a learning disability? Who wants to start with the start? Steve, go for it.
Just to get a few things off my chest, first thing, start things off.
And are we recording, Rebecca?
Yeah, I can see a recording
yes.
on.
Wonderful. Steve.
Yeah, in terms of jobs, I think there have been some small gains due to bubbling. So, for example, in the university, we've had to, for certain services, bubble people in morning and afternoon groups where people can't be in the same. So potentially it's creating some opportunities for people, for more people, because they can't spread across the two bubbles. That's one thing. Certainly, we've seen some logistics gains with, you know, the so much going onto the internet now, although they're generally low level jobs. In our NHS world in Wales, we've certainly seen some pros and cons. We've seen people who were on internships in March taken on immediately as you know, in cleaning and all sorts of other roles. And we've had other opportunities that have been completely barred to us as the hospital have closed down. So, you know, we've won some and we've lost some. Certainly, we echo the idea that that people have been valued and seen as valuable. With SMEs, we've also seen supported employment. Yeah, it's a bit of an esoteric one, but supported employment have been very helpful advising people on furlough, getting people out, advising on welfare benefits, and have actually, you know, been very helpful to keep people in the role and therefore to invite them back at the end of it. So it's not new jobs, but it's kept a lot of jobs, having those agencies and organisations with skills involved. The other area I think is policy. Clearly, there's a lot more money around for schemes to get people into work. Part of our job, I think, is to make sure that people with learning disabilities and autism can access them, Kickstart being one of them. It's a bit of a dog's dinner, Kickstart, but we've been quite successful with Welsh Government arguing that they need to underpin it with job coaching to make sure that if that's the route, the subsidised route into work, let's have some of that for people with learning disabilities. I'll stop.
Mike, and then I'm going to take Yolande, then I'm going to take Stephen, then I'm going to take Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Len. I mean, to answer the question specifically about COVID offering some new opportunities, I think for me the wider context is that this is a once in a generation pandemic, so the whole world is different. I think people's levels of awareness about individual vulnerability is heightened. I'm seeing that wherever I go, and I think that the impact on the economy, on lives and livelihoods, has focused people's minds on what's really important about being human beings. And this is something that I don't think I've seen before in my lifetime, in the context of people's lived experience informing policy and policy decision making. So I think that it's an opportunity for the hearts and minds to be engaged, perhaps for the first time that I've ever seen. It's an opportunity for the lived experience of the people who are most vulnerable to COVID to be heard and listened to. And because there's a reset of all our thinking around income, employment, housing, and everything else, this is an opportunity to actually speak truth to power. And one of the things that Kirk said in the plenary earlier on was that there are lots of people doing lots of good things, but the barriers are clear. And the barriers aren't being set by the people that are doing all the work on the front line. They're being set by the decision makers above them. So here's an opportunity to actually transform that level of debate and engage the people who hold the strings, hold the purse for the money, and speak truth to power. And I think COVID gives us that opportunity.
So it is next Yolande, then Stephen, Lismore, and then Jen.
Thanks, Leander. Everything that Mike just said. I think that, but I don't think we can underestimate the challenge that we've got on our hands to keep people in the mindset that Mike's just been talking about. It's a very unfortunate human condition to row back to what we knew before. We have to keep pushing very hard the fact that they're, you know, to stick with Mike's once in a generation position that we're in, to remind people that at some point all of us went, there's got to be something better than this. And they weren't talking about the problems we're in with COVID. They were talking about yesterday. They were talking about before COVID. COVID hasn't given us the problems that we're seeing. It simply exposed them for what they are. So I think our challenge now is to, so with all the new policy that's coming in, with all the new programs, projects, with all the work around social and economic recovery, is to absolutely ensure that I'm London, talking about London, we're holding us hard, and we've all got to commit ourselves to it.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Steve, then I'm going to take Jen, then I'm going to hand over to Ruth to see if Ruth can help us craft something in terms of the response to this question that collectively we are happy with. Does that make sense? So it's Steve, and then it's Jen, and then it's going to be over to Ruth.
Okay. Well, if I speak first from personal experience, although most DWP staff are policy staff are now working from home, I'm continuing to work in an office, and there are lots of new faces around here who we had to employ to be able to do that. So there's lots of intensive cleaning regimes, new staff in the front door, etc. So there is some recruitment going on in our organization. I'm sure that's true in other organizations, and as people have already said, one of the keys in all of this is making sure that your target group is being thought about when those new recruitment programs are coming along. Now, looking longer term, there are clearly some trends in employment which are going to stay in place whatever happens COVID-wise. So the move towards more homework, I think most commentators say, will be a continuing feature of the labour market. Now, we've talked in DWP that in some cases that could remove some barriers for disabled staff, but it's probably more for people who have physical disabilities, the ones who no longer have to try and get to work on public transport or get up a set of stairs where there's no lift, etc. Probably less helpful for people with learning disabilities. But again, worth thinking about is are there some barriers which have disappeared which might actually enable people to move in more easily into the labour market?
And I think Rebecca's trying to tell us about timekeeping.
Right, and I'll stop there then. So there's a few ideas, but I think in summary I think we should be thinking about where is the labour market going in a strategic sense, and how do you make sure that your target group is getting into that.
So Nurjahan, I'm going to take Jen, and then I'll take you really quickly, because what we need to do is pull this together in terms of this particular question. Jen.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise from kind of, I suppose, the NHS jobs perspective, where obviously what we're seeing COVID jobs raised really highly. We know recruitment is ramping up because of the need. And I guess it's kind of looking at some of the initiatives that have been talked about today. Actually, how do we promote them, make them more visible to employers? Because I'm not entirely sure that employers really realise that there's these types of initiatives out there, and that actually could be really helpful for them to get the right people into the job and get their recruitments filled that they need. And I think there's probably a really good role that NHS jobs can play in that. You mentioned about 40 trusts being signed up before, and I'm just thinking, if there's a way so NHS jobs can help kind of promote roles that would help people with learning disabilities. We've heard a raft of information that people don't really realise jobs are out there for them. I think NHS jobs is purely clinical, and there's not something for them out there. So actually, it's how do we promote it to people and make that awareness there as well, that it's a different range of jobs that they can get into.
And Elan's just reminded me that you can use the chat feature so that we can help record that as well. Nurjahan.
It's very much a sort of a question to throw out there, or a comment really, about, as well as learning disability and autism, young people moving into jobs within the NHS. We have partners that we work with, local authorities, voluntary community sector organisations, who may have setups and roles within them that, through the partnership working with perhaps the local NHS or the trusts that support deliver supported internship, there may be potential for roles amongst our partners, which then opens that up to a wider sort of collective ownership of working with young people with learning learning disability and autism. So it's just something to think about that. As much as I believe in work in the NHS and think it's one of the best employers, and through Project Search, Project Choice has done fantastic work, and everything we've heard from today, we have partners there that perhaps could offer something.
So just one of the sort of challenges that might present is that if we look to the NHS, we employ up to between 1.2 and 1.5 million people. I think if we could demonstrate leadership and use that leverage, then we might be in a position to go to much smaller voluntary organisations without the infrastructure or the resources that we have within the NHS and could deploy. And so I think it might be quite important to actually look first to us in terms of what we can achieve and what we must do to actually achieve this. Just some thoughts.
Local authorities and national organisations and so on, I agree they need infrastructure and funding and so on, but it's not necessarily the catch-all. So there are local authorities and people who could potentially help. So it's about looking to work with our partners.
So, Ruth, what do you make of this in terms of drawing together something we could feed back in terms of question C?
Okay, I've tried to do a little bit of grouping of points as we've gone along. So on a sort of micro level, there are some new roles, new opportunities. There's the double staffing that Steve mentioned. There are new roles that Stephen mentioned. Extra cleaning roles and so on that are coming out of this at the moment. So that's one area. There are
people like that. Show me a hand if that's feeling good. Feeling good.
Okay. There are new, with more people struggling to get into work because of the current situation or to hold on to jobs potentially. There are some new initiatives like Kickstart. They give us a chance to make sure that people with a learning disability are included in those, but that's a job of work for us representing that target group to make sure that they are.
Do I see a thumb?
Okay.
Ruth.
There's the macro kind of point, which is there's the potential for a whole new world beginning, the reset button being pressed, and that we could take that opportunity to influence policy to make sure that it's a better world for people with learning disability. But backed against that is Yolanda's point that it's going to be a challenge to keep people in that mindset rather than regressing to previous habits. Is that one okay? And final point, I suppose it's about keeping an eye on new trends in terms of working practices. But there's a bit of antipathy about home working, because that may not represent a positive gain for people with learning disabilities, but it's likely that other new trends might emerge. I'd like to lob in a quick point example there myself, which is we've certainly as an employer thought about, I suppose, a bit more like job carving or task-based work. We have got this thing that needs to be done, and we're looking at how many of those could we actually put out to our colleges and say, do you have a group of learners who could do this for us? So I think if more people could think in that way, I think there is more task-based work out there. If we could jump onto that a little bit, that might be helpful.
Can I just, another issue that colleagues have raised in the chat is about more flexible working. I think we'd need to consider the issues of occupational segregation. Many of the reasons that certain groups have died and been hospitalised disproportionately because of COVID is because they can't work at home. So if the jobs that people with a learning disability are disproportionately located in from an occupational perspective are not jobs that easily allow them, i.e. cleaning jobs or catering jobs. And I'm not saying that that's all somebody with a learning disability can do, but if those are the jobs we've disproportionately employed people in, they're not going to be working at home. So I think we need to sort of think through, if they've got a policy role, yes, they could work from home. So some of the NHS England staff could work from home. But otherwise, that type of flexibility may not be open. The other issue is if we're also looking for structure and support, which many people with a learning disability need in terms of routine and consistency, do those working at home opportunities then offer different challenges as well? And how would we meet those support needs? Yeah. So, colleagues, we've got the second question, which is, I think we're all happy with what Ruth is going to feed back from us. Yes? Great. Then the next question is, and Ruth, are you happy to feed back on D? What would the group most like to see as a follow-up from today? And so my suggestion would be each person speaks to, but also puts in the chat what they would most like to see. And then let's see if we've got any consensus. So if I could start with Jen first. D, what would you most like to see as a follow-up? And then let's see if we've got any consensus.
I think as a follow-up from kind of what we've been talking about today is what people had spoken about earlier, was about having those, I suppose, a specific agreed action kind of from today, actually like hone it down so it's not just a, you know, with list of things that we would like to achieve. It's actually what can we do, take it little by little. You know, we can be ambitious and that's great, but actually what's achievable in the kind of short term to take us.
And if you can make sure you put it into the chat as well, because we want to take all of the richness. Richard, as you've now moved down, what would you most like to get out of today?
So I think, can I do two things? I mean, one, we've talked about leadership, and I think that does start at the very top, doesn't it? So I think, you know, from Simon Stevens or even Secretary of State, this needs to be talked about at all those levels. I think quite practically around some of the work arm's length bodies are doing. So we've had initiatives around recruitment, for example, or the anchor institutes. This is part of it. So it doesn't become a silo again, that's something that's distant, that whenever we talk about jobs, this is part of it. So I think there's something very practical to be done, because there's an awful lot happening at the moment. And all the arm's length bodies are part of that. So let's make sure this is part of the strategies that are being implemented. Just so you know, one of my colleagues is leading on the anchor institutions work with colleagues in strategy group. Brilliant. Mike?
Yeah, I've got three specifics on most like to see. First is that there be no excuse for inaction. The second is that we should have a healthy impatience with slow progress. And the third is to identify the barriers that are standing in the way and seek to overcome them.
Okay. I'm going to come to you last, JP. So Stephen Lismore.
I think I'd just follow straight on from what Mike's just said is I'd like some really practical ideas about, well, where are the barriers? You know, we've all got good intentions. Where are we encountering barriers, and can those barriers actually be overcome in some way?
I'm going to take Steve Bayer last. I'm going to go to Nur Jahan.
Actually, just an idea that I've had based on comments and on the chat function. So the example that Stephen Bayer's put in about the interns doing the data prep, do we have somewhere lists of some of the type of activities and jobs that people do, both within and outside of hospitals, but also particularly now because of COVID that can be done from home, both the roles that are complex and practical, so say catering to policy. That would be really helpful, because I think it might help both the senior strategic and operational colleagues visualise the possibilities. And that leads me to my second point, again, based on comments and my personal experience. So we've had comments in this meeting and the other meeting about senior leaders. Are they the barrier, or is it the middle managers? Are they the barrier? One of the things that might help is actually engaging with, interacting with people with lived experience of learning disability and or autism. You know, how many of us, you know, in this round table, but those that make decisions actually have met someone with learning disability and have somewhat of an understanding, so that it will help them visualize through the barriers. I feel some of that practical will help.
Just to say, all of the work the LDEP does has been done in partnership with people with a learning disability, including lived experience people from MenCap and also lived experience people in relation to People First as well. Steve, barriers. You have a little bit of an experience of barriers, don't you?
Me?
Yeah. Your research
yeah,
might have identified the odd few.
Yeah, there are lots. I think. I think what one is this perennial cross-departmental coordination element. You know, we got people from everywhere as part of this meeting, but when push comes to shove, you end up with internal objectives taking over. You know, the real time that people have got to plan, and we've certainly seen the benefit of having a cross-departmental czar in Wales around employability. You know, we don't have responsibility for employment directly, but that, you know, they're trying to coordinate all of the initiatives for recovery, both where are the jobs coming from, but also you know, how do we help people to stay in work and get into work? And that's been extremely helpful in our discussions with people about how we might fit into lots of emerging and different boxes. I can see a benefit of that, certainly. Behaviourally, I think it picks up on Najahan's point that we need to make this behaviourally real for middle managers as well. You know, we can train people, we can do all sorts of things, but giving them images of possibility about what they could do and making it their business rather than somebody else's business to find that opportunity to remove that, you know, barrier to recruitment is an important one, and that becomes part of performance management as well as training. I think we've certainly seen major moves forward where we as experimental researchers have addressed manager performance and not just training people with ideas and awareness. Those will probably do for a minute.
JP, and then I'm going to take Ruth.
Oh, okay, I've just written all of mine in the chat, but I'm really new to this world. But what's really, really clear is people saying, we know what to do. We've known it for years. And the senior leaders talk great talk, but it's just so slow in getting stuff done. And it's like there's this yes minister thing where there's a set of techniques that the system or people within the system have to slow stuff down, to stop it from happening. So we need to sort of forensically examine what those slowing techniques are, and then what can be done to challenge them.
Ruth, you've got the challenge of feeding back. Any thoughts about what we would want to see, that we would most want to see, and let's test it with the group.
Okay. This is a bit less coordinated than the last one, but I think people want this to have not been a talking shop, that actions must follow from it. That we focus not on the overall what we want to achieve, because there's a lot of consensus around that already, but the steps we need to take to do that, including identifying what the challenges are and how we overcome them. The challenges both for employers, you know, working to address some of the barriers that employers throw up, but also actually that policymakers throw up. So that's the issue. The other one, to join up this work with that of other strategic groups working in the same area. There's lots of people being brought together today, but this shouldn't become another separate group working on this. Slightly linked is the need then for a cross-departmental government approach to tackling it all, that again, it shouldn't sit in a silo of a particular department. I would presume that the national strategy for disabled people ought to give us a platform for doing that. And finally, is that there's a sense of urgency about all of this, and that it really shouldn't be allowed to drift any longer. there's some specific examples I think Nurjahan mentioned, which I could include. So some of the specific things we could do quite quickly are that collecting examples of a wide range of roles that people with learning disability have taken up successfully, ensuring that policymakers, employers, decision makers have much more contact with people with learning disability to make it real for them. I could lob those in as examples of actions that we could take.
We still got roughly 10 minutes before we're going back into the main group, assuming that my clock is correct, which it does look like it is. So we've got some space for people to add. I mean, do we like, I give a thumbs up to what Ruth just said for question D. Mike, thumbs up, thumbs up. I suppose, given that we've got Mike here from the People Directorate and the People Plan, one of the things that I would be really interested in is how can this work really start to inform the People Plan or the next iteration of the People Plan?
I think that the work on the workforce disability equality standard, which collects data across the NHS, it tells us where which employers are the best at making reasonable adjustments, which employers are the best at recruiting people with disabilities, where they're working, what jobs they're doing. And because the People Plan and the People Directorate are telling the rest of the NHS that we look after our people, we care about our people, we're on board when it comes to looking at protected characteristics, then, and you'll know this from me, Leander, I've been saying that we have to practice what we preach. The NHS will talk about all the progress it's made on race, for example. We put a lot of resources into the race equality standard. Why don't we mirror that with disability? That's one of the first pledges I made when I came into post, that we would give equal vigour and equal weight to the disability characteristic as we do to race. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what I've put in my 3 things about a healthy impatience. The problem for me, not being somebody who's got NHS DNA in him, is that I don't understand why things move so slowly. I can see some of the policies, procedures, ways of working that lend themselves to that, but I don't see that being a legitimate excuse for not acting more quickly. So when people talk to me about race in the NHS, and they trot out detailed slides about all the things that are being done to make it better, I still say it's too slow. So that healthy skepticism about things moving slowly is one of the main drivers. And the point that has been made several times about barriers, where the barriers are. I think JP made the point about, we were talking about this for years. Most people that work with disabilities have been talking about this for years. Steve's been talking about it for years. We know what the barriers are. So we need a leap of imagination and a leap of faith about how those things can be overcome. And we've got to practice what we preach. If we're saying it, then we've got to do it. And for me, there isn't any excuse. So I think that healthy impatience and that healthy frustration is something that we need to use as a proper driver.
Okay, does anybody, we've got about 3 minutes, because what we'll do is we'll go back into the new group so that we'll be Steve Bayer. You're on mute.
Sorry. I think, on the demand side, if Mike's aspirations come true, then jobs will be there. The one thing that I worry about, the whole thing stalling, is the lack of skilled job coaching that NHS can draw on. You know, we've seen good examples of follow-on job coaching. We've seen the Alliance, which is, you know, providing money from all sorts in the jigsaw to put people together. We've made a suggestion based on our research in Wales that they create a national job coaching service within Wales to underpin, you know, a lot of initiatives, including supported apprenticeships, which, you know, we think should be there for people with higher level skills and aspirations. And a supported employment, supported internship offer. DWP are sitting on a scoping exercise on local supported employment. They've bought into the model, but they haven't finalised, you know, any national offer on that because it's got caught up in COVID, and also they haven't finished testing yet. You know, on the basis of bringing the vaccine forward quicker, I would want, if they got DWP's got their checkbook out, I'd like to see that come out and maybe even be linked to NHS, you know, development, to allow it to flourish, because without it, you know, if you're successful, it won't work because the resources won't be there to underpin it.
So that infrastructure is absolutely pivotal, is what you're saying. All right, does anybody want to say anything else? We've got a couple of minutes before we're moving back into subgroups. Main group.
Leander, if I just come in, I've never worked in the NHS, but I suspect it's a large bureaucratic organisation, a bit like civil service, and my experience of that is managers have so many things to manage against. If they haven't got a numerical target, it tends to disappear, and so, you know, one of the things I think we should be saying is you should have a target for increasing learning disabled employment within NHS and within every other major employer. And if you doubled learning disabled employment, you'd still only go up to less than 10%. So, you know, it's not like you're being asked to do an awful lot, but that would seem to be the sort of thing we should be aiming at.
But with the infrastructure to make it work, because otherwise people will come in, we don't support them, and then they leave. So a target without there being the infrastructure to make it work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But the target would be about sustained employment rather than just recruitment, for example. So people would have to look at the longer term picture.
And what do you think in terms of DFE and DWP and Cabinet Office and the disability strategy underpinning how some of that will work and how some of that will happen?
Well, I just say my experience with the Disability Confident initiative is we had lots of government targets, and it's only when you finally started talking seriously to employers and got them to own it that you started making real progress. So so just saying, well, it's up to government to make something happen, you're probably not going to have much success. You have to get the employers to own it in a real way and to write it into their business plan. You know, like, lots of us have been saying, well, it's, you know, it's not about being goodies, it's about there's business reasons for improving your recruitment practices and your retention practices. So get them to recognize that, and then they start delivering on it, and particularly if they can be delivering against numerical targets.
Yolande, is there anything you wanted to say before we move back into the main group?
Just very quickly, I completely agree that this is something we have to get employers to own. Some of the strategy around that is how can we help them to own it, but own it in the long term. I think that's hugely important. I do think, again, agree that the government can't be seen to be driving this if we need employers to own it. But I do think the level of fracturing at policy level within government when it starts to talk, so Kickstart would be the perfect example. Let's put a really good paid incentive into play, which basically knocks virtually every other employment programme out of the ballpark, including supported internships. It felt like a terrible own goal. I don't get me wrong, Stephen, I applaud what the government is trying to do here, but actually where we need the government to work harder is to work across its departments to make sure it is speaking the same language, and it's actually making the message run in the right direction. Because you're right, we need employers to own this, but some of the policy incentives that government puts behind helping employers, nudging employers in the right direction, let's nudge them in one direction, not 12.
Okay, for colleagues, that was a wonderful note on, well, challenging, but wonderful note on which to end. Everybody knows you've got to go back into the original invitation from 1 to 4 p.m. Thank you so much. And does this see you the other side, colleagues?